Spaghetti.
The presentation on the Rwanda genocide is a good starting point for me in particular, since I come from a family of survivors myself from the Nazi Holocaust of the Jewish people, not the least of which was the toll of that particular apocalypse, the Second World War, which led to the deaths of 55, 60 million people, including the 5 to 6 million Jewish people. And of my own family, there was 4 survivors from each of my mother's maternal and paternal families from Warsaw and Lublin. And the consequences of that Holocaust are still not played out. And we have the resultant of the establishment of the Zionist State of Israel, which was presented as the logical conclusion of the Holocaust and a solution for the genocide of the Jewish people. However, this is far from the truth. It seems that around genocide there's a lot of lies that are perpetuated. And in order to get down to the source of the problem that has caused the Jewish people to be counterposed to the Palestinian people, I've had to go into political philosophy and into a critique of the Hegelian Nation-State itself. Because this impasse has not been resolved by any of the traditional means available to international diplomacy. And this continuing impasse is not only stagnant, but it's getting worse. And we can see the results this week in terms of the extraterritorial assault made by the Israel military against international peace activists. Now, I have a very succinct presentation here of only 4 pages, but it's very condensed. So I'll ask for your attention in this matter. The problem of the dichotomy that is presented as being one between the Palestinian people and the Jewish people is an antinomy, that is a false contradiction, now only recognized as a war with an international scope located in the State of Israel. The hypothesis that emerges from my research into the areas of national identity and self-determination is relevant to the analytical approach of the concepts of nation and that of the state, that is generally applicable to any state in light of the conflict between the Palestinian people and the State of Israel. The paradigm of Hans Kohm's parameters in the distinction between inclusive and exclusive tendencies of the concept of nationalism has provided the framework for many analyses which have dealt with the related phenomena in the nation. This paradigm could be called the School of Nationalism, the Association for the Studies of Ethnicity and Nationalism, located in the London School of Economics and Political Science. However, before taking into consideration the applicability of such a paradigm, we must first determine the nature of the nation, and then determine whether the concept of nationalism applies. The preliminary question is whether a given social formation is considered a nation, and consequently, if nationalism is applicable to such a formation followed by its right to self-determination. Most definitions of the nation are linked to the ideologies of liberalism and Marxism, which provide a notion of a nation which is characterized by the attributes that are similar to those of the state. In effect, the definition of the state is glued to that of the nation if we refer to the nation-state proposal by Hegel. As such, this concept is a tautology that makes little distinction between the state and the nation. The nation is then defined as the state, although various social formations assume the identity of a nation without a state, or without the characteristics of a state. In addition, existing social formations claim their national identity and self-determination as a state on the same territory as is claimed by another such formation with its own distinct national identity. Therefore, the notion of inclusive nationalism does not function for such a contradiction, and in particular for a social formation that is not recognized as a nation, even though it exhibits its own identity. Viewed on a large scale, problematic relates to the nations without international recognition and the minoritarian nations within a state. To resolve this problem, the classical studies of European political philosophy take into consideration the social groups that are identified by the concepts of civil society within a state. Considering that the social collectivities are identified by their own means as a nation and are organized as their own civil society, it may be inferred that it is possible to recognize these social groups and nations by something other than the state. In any case, most states have evolved on the back of an existing nation. Consequently, civil society becomes the means by which the nation is organized, but not necessarily as the state, thus reversing the proposition from Hegel, which assumed the state as form, capital F, and content as civil society. If we may recognize the state as the content of a concept, the state is no longer the essence of the concept and may be replaced by the deliberations of a constituent assembly, for example. The method by which a constitutional settlement may occur is necessarily based on the principle of reciprocity, which removes any inequality between social groups, communities, or even individuals. The constitutional format for such a proposal is elaborated by the Austrian school in the concept of national cultural autonomy by Otto Bauer in his recently translated thesis. The concept itself was founded in the 1903 Congress of the Jewish Bund, in the same year as it was expelled from the Russian Social Democratic Party by both Lenin's Iskra and the Guelph's adherents. My argument concerns the proposals of the School of Nationalism, including the formal criteria postulating the artificial nation of Israel, rendering it impossible to recognize the Palestinian nation. Consequently, this elaboration concludes with a proposal for mutual recognition between the two nations with the reciprocal sharing together in a given society where territory and resources are shared in a proportional manner. The theory of nationalism, however, proposes a two-state solution or a binational state. The failure of the previous proposal is evident, and the internal contradiction of the latter is on display as well. That's basically the hypothesis of my thesis. And I've had to go to do a critique of the very fundamental nature of what is normally considered to be political science, that is the study of the state, or Hegel's term, that's the Wissenschaft, knowledge of the state. This is what the traditional political science is all about. However, this example of the impasse between the Palestinian people and the State of Israel illustrates that this framework is inadequate to a solution of the problem. We have to go outside of the framework of the knowledge of the state in and of itself in order to find a solution to the impasse presented by this conflict, in which a state is suppressing the existence of a given people, their civil society, not to mention the proposed mini-state that was presented as the option in the Oslo Agreement and the solution of the Camp David Agreement, so-called. So I would ask for a serious consideration of what I recognize as a very radical sort of a critique of the nation-state proposal, even though most societies are organized on this basis of a nation-state. And yet, at the same time, we see that most of these nation-states present one crisis after another. In Belgium, for instance, we have a paralysis of the governmental apparatus with two nations present. In Switzerland, we have two solitudes, as we have in Canada, which do not relate to each other culturally in an adequate fashion. So there's various crises which are presented within the context of the nation-state proposal, and I offer my critique of the Hegelian nation-state as the beginning of an opening to develop alternative constitutional means by which the coexistence of the various nations within the same society can be resolved through a principle of reciprocity. And this is obligatorily must be formulated as a social constitution within a constituent assembly, which is the only way in which one can surpass the centralized nation-state apparatus, which has been the norm, and which is the basis of the current United Nations as well, which is not very functional as a result, because the more powerful nation-states, of course, insist upon their veto power. I invite you as well to accept a copy of the documentary study that I wrote on the Sabra massacre, which took place in 1982 when Israel first invaded Lebanon. And this illustrates the role of the Israel military at the time under the leadership of General Sharon, who later became Prime Minister of Israel, even though the inquiry that was conducted by Israel subsequently declared that this General Sharon should not assume any major political responsibilities in that state because of his role in organizing this massacre with his allies, who were the Phalangist movement of Lebanon, based in the Christian political culture of Lebanon, in opposition to the Sunni Palestinian Muslim population, which unbalanced the relationship of forces within Lebanon between the Muslim and Christian populations, and posed a threat to that particular state at that time. So all of these dynamics are reflected in the nature of the nation-state, and this is one particular example. And Gaza, the recent Gaza war of 2009, is another example which illustrates the unviability of such a constitutional apparatus, which inevitably results in the suppression of one nation or another. So I offer this critique and ask for your interventions at this time.
Okay, Adam, your question.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm not sure that I followed completely your Hegelian analysis. The thing that, since your title is the Palestinian-Israeli Impasse, the thing that has struck me for a very long time is that Jewish state keeps referring to the Holocaust that undoubtedly the Jewish people were subjected to. But the policy of the Jewish state appears to me to be inviting a Holocaust which would be on even more horrific dimensions through its nationalistic policies. This is the thing that strikes me, and I have a feeling in general that it's as if we, certainly in the West, are living in a kind of a schizophrenic world, as if violence and war can be the solution to problems. So from this standpoint, apart from the propaganda that is constantly emitted by the Jewish state, I really personally take a dim view of the points that Israel is putting out. And I think it's deplorable from the standpoint of humanity that not only the suffering people of Palestine, but the people of the world are constantly subjected to the fear of a further Holocaust. I've been a little bit long-winded, and I hope you'll be more short-winded in your answer than me. But this is the thing that really strikes me. The human right to peace is being constantly violated, it appears to me, by the Israeli nation-state.
I don't fear a Holocaust per se from the Palestinian people. Palestinian people whom I know to a certain extent do not consider it necessary to expel or eradicate or annihilate the Jewish Israeli population in order to achieve their own national needs. I think that we should have a certain confidence in the Palestinian struggle and recognize that they are seeking their own security and national autonomy without considering that it would necessitate the removal of the Israeli Jewish population in one way or another. This is not presented by any faction of the Palestinian political culture. And in fact, the current phase of the Intifada, the insurrection against the occupation from Israel, is of a civil disobedience character, of a nonviolent character. And we have various actions, both locally and internationally, which are being conducted by the Palestinian resistance and the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, which are of a nonviolent character. The previous phase of suicide bombings that occurred, which were targeting civilian populations of Jewish Israelis, was ended, for political reasons, and not because there was a wall, the separation wall that was being constructed, between the two territories, which has not even been completed, and is still, and even those portions that have been completed are still accessible to being crossed over by the Palestinians in about 20 different sites, I understand, and yet there's no attempts being made, to perpetuate that phenomenon of suicide bombings because Palestinians themselves consider it to be counterproductive. The Israelis themselves offer a source of opposition to the occupation, not to mention the international Jewish opposition, which is very strong in these last years, and which offers the possibility of putting a pressure on the Israeli Jewish population, which cannot be negated by any excuses, such as the traditional excuses that the critiques of Israel are coming from states that previously allowed for the Holocaust to take place, and therefore these critiques are invalid, by Jewish standards. So the Jewish opposition, though, cannot be negated in this fashion, because the Jewish opposition comes from very oftentimes individuals who are themselves members of families who were survivors of the Holocaust. In particular, I refer to Dr. Norman Finkelstein, who is no longer a professor since he was expelled from Duke University, DePaul University, and myself as well, as a longtime activist and an oppositionist to the State of Israel since '68, as a matter of fact. I am also from a Holocaust survivor family, and this political culture of the Jewish people is very much related to the pre-war Jewish opposition to the Zionist movement, which was a majoritarian movement in Poland, where my mother comes from, in Warsaw, where the Jewish Bund was fighting for Jewish civil rights within the framework of that given society, and which rejected the Zionist proposition that the Polish Jewish people should give up, on their homeland, which was Poland, and flee away to some other territory, which they would take by force, from another people. This proposition was rejected by the majority of the Jewish people. However, that majority of Jewish people no longer exists, and the leadership of that movement was destroyed by both the Nazi Holocaust and by the Stalinist repression. As a result, the remaining Jewish leadership, which existed in the Occidental world, was the Zionist parties of one sort or another, who took over the Jewish political culture and have insisted upon imposing that particular ideology on the Jewish people. So the Jewish opposition is repressed to a great extent by the Zionist parties, even more so than any other sort of source of opposition, which can be discounted fairly easily by the Zionist movement. But the Jewish opposition, which cannot be discounted easily, is suppressed to an even greater extent for that reason. And so, for both reasons, that the Palestinian political culture is not sectarian towards the Jewish people per se, and because there is a strong Jewish opposition, I don't think that the conflict between the Palestinian people and the State of Israel is going to result in the kind of catastrophe that is often mentioned as a possibility, and often used as an excuse for providing unparalleled support, to the State of Israel, despite the war crimes that it has committed under
Thank you. And sometime, hopefully, in our general council meeting, we will talk about, adopt a motion in terms of the most recent Israeli rage on the peace floating out. So that will, thank you so much, Abraham. And I would like to move to introduce Dr. Rose Dyson. Incidentally,